Well, it was just in the form of a set of questions I asked where, artificial intelligence is something people talk about nonstop in Silicon Valley, but they almost never talk about its dual use. If it's real, if this is a real thing, it obviously can also be used by the military. It'll be weaponized in all sorts of ways, and it's an important national security question as to who has it. There's this very peculiar background where Google is working with the Chinese communist government and not with the U.S. military. So the Project Maven decision was a decision not to work with AI with the U.S. military, but they're working with the communist Chinese. And so the question is, from the outside, is just what in the world is going on there? And I sort of suggested a few different possibilities, but I think it's been they've described it as a Manhattan Project for AI. And so if you go around broadcasting that you're building the Manhattan Project for AI, I would think this naturally would draw the attention of foreign intelligence agencies. I think the Chinese are competent enough that the Ministry of State Security is likely to have infiltrated Google. And then I think the Google management has sort of a decision of either letting the software go out the front door or figuring it'll get stolen anyway and go out the back door. And then I think, of course, there's probably a broad base of Google employees that are ideologically super left-wing, sort of woke, and think that China's better than the U.S. or that the U.S. is worse than China. It's more anti-American than anything.
I'm assuming that part of this is your dismay about the current state of American universities, that there's a kind of creativity or innovation that's either not sufficiently nourished or not sustained or even damped down in American universities. And since I'm a university professor, I have tenure, so I could say what I want, but nevertheless, I think universities and what we do for our students is amazing things. But you have a jaundiced view of American universities. So tell us why.
Well, it's always I certainly think that we are in something of an educational bubble. It's the way I always like to describe it. We've been in an age of bubbles in all sorts of areas, and I think there's also a bubble in education, and it's manifested by the ever-rising tuition costs on universities. So the question of what universities are doing is a very different question at a certain tuition level. And if the tuition is 4 times as much, which is roughly what they've risen since 1980, adjusted for inflation, you'd end up with a very different set of questions. We now have $1.3 trillion of student debt. It was only $300 billion in 2000. It's gone up by something like a factor of 4 in nominal dollars in 15 years. The economic sort of description of it is often, what kind of a good is education? Is it an investment? So you're going to college as an investment into a future? Or is it a consumption good, where it's like a 4-year party? And so these are 2 very different kinds of things. And often, when I started my critique of colleges, I thought it was sort of a weird superposition of an investment good and a consumption good, which is why people were confused. So they thought they were investing, but they were really consuming. But I've now come to think that it's actually a combination of 2 things that are much crazier than those 2 even. It's, on the one hand, it's the main reason people go to college is actually as an insurance product, where people go to college because they're scared of falling through the very big cracks in our society. And so even if it's not a great investment, it's still important to buy insurance. This is why parents save up so much money to send their kids to college, and then why the kids take out so much in student debt.
You have to avoid confusing the specific and the general. Google is a great company. It has 30,000 people. They have or 20,000, whatever the numbers. They have pretty safe jobs. On the other hand, Google also has 30, 40, 50 billion in cash. It has no idea how to invest that money in technology effectively. And so it prefers getting 0% interest from Mr. Bernanke. Effectively, the cash sort of gets burned away over time through inflation. because there are no ideas that Google has on how to spend the money.
So, let me see if I can help Peter answer your question.
But you have $50 billion at Google. Why don't you spend it on doing more in tech? Or are you out of ideas? And it's not. And I think Google does more than most companies. You're trying to do things with self-driving cars and supposedly with asteroid mining, although maybe that's just part of the propaganda ministry. And you're doing more than Microsoft or Apple or a lot of these other companies. And the fact that you're out of ideas, maybe it's a political problem. The government's outlawed things, but it still is a problem. But then the intellectually honest thing to do would be to say that Google is no longer a technology company. And that it's basically a search engine. The search technology was developed a decade ago. It's a bet that there will be no one else who will come up with a better search technology. So you invest in Google because you're betting against technological innovation in search. And it's like a bank that generates enormous cash flows every year, but you can't issue a dividend because the day you take that $30 billion and send it back to people, you're admitting that you're no longer a technology company.
I want to sort of suggest that we should maybe think of it at least in one dimension as sort of a political question, and it's a movement, and it's a political question whether this movement is going to succeed, or whether the enemies of the movement are going to succeed in stopping us, and so I want to maybe end with an enemies list, a list of people who I think are stopping Bitcoin. And they all have, many of them have, there's sort of a lot of them, they tend to have this sort of nameless, faceless bureaucrat perspective, which is of course one of the ways they hide. But we're gonna try to expose them and realize that this is sort of what we have to fight for Bitcoin to go 10x or 100x from here. So enemy number one. I think he's sort of. I think the sort of the sociopathic grandpa from Omaha is perhaps the most honest and the most direct in it.
The same, I think, is true of diversity. This is another one of these incredibly misleading, euphemistic terms. It does not, to put it charitably, have much to do with a diversity of ideas. You do not have real diversity on a college campus when you have a campus full of people who look different but think alike. One of the questions I always get asked is, what are some trends in technology? What are things that are happening? I always find this to be this is probably the question I dislike the most that I get asked on many different stops on this book tour, because you're sort of tempted to just give these very banal answers like there'll be more people using cell phones in 5 years, which don't really tell you very much of one sort or another. But I think the general theme I would suggest is that all trends are overrated. And so if you think about current trends in technology, healthcare IT software, education software, overrated. SaaS enterprise software, really overrated. Big data, cloud computing, if you hear those words, you need to think fraud. You need to run away as fast as you possibly can. Problem. When people use the word science, it's often a tell, like in poker, that you're bluffing. And so it's like we have social science, we have political science. We don't call it physical science or chemical science. We just call them physics and chemistry because we just know they're right. And you can debate the periodic table of elements. No one will be upset if you ask questions about that. We call it climate science. It's a tell, like in poker. It's telling you that people are exaggerating and that they're bluffing.